Good morning, Lisi. No, I do not hear you, Lisi.
Do you hear me coming through?
Yes, now I do. But you are echoey.
See if that helps. Nope.
Lisi is our presenter today, and she's having some audio issues. So she'll come back in. Sometimes exiting Zoom and coming back in corrects it. So thanks for your patience. Welcome, everybody, to the NCRAN monthly webinar. Our presenter is Lisi Brown, and she had some technical difficulties this morning, so she left and she's coming back in. Hopefully that has fixed it.
Do you hear me? Do you hear me?
Yes. Yep, you sound good.
Whoa. Oh, that was frightening. You never want to have that happen on a webinar. I got to call our tech support. I was actually noticed something was wrong with my computer last night, and I thought I fixed it, but apparently it is not fixed. I am dropping a handout, a worksheet in chat. Feel free to grab that and download it. One is a PowerPoint that you can type in. One is a PDF that you can look at. But go ahead and grab that worksheet. Even if you can't print or type, just have a piece of paper and kind of use that worksheet as a guide. So yes, my name is Lisi Brown, and I am a gerontologist with South Dakota State University Extension. And I am here today to present Generations United, Breaking Stereotypes and Fostering Communication. I am a gerontologist by training. I received a master's degree from St. Cloud State University in Minnesota, and I have been in my role with South Dakota since 2012. I am located in Rapid City, but I serve the whole state of South Dakota. I work on aging in place, aging well, family caregiving, and life planning. So again, this is that worksheet that I was mentioning. Even if you can't download it or type in it, you can peek at it and use it as a guide, because we are going to be using it to brainstorm today. So our learning objectives today, we will be identifying the generations and their birth years. We will compare and contrast generational stereotypes, and we will discuss how to communicate across different generations. First activity of our day, I want you to take about a minute, maybe a minute and a half, and write down the birth years for each generation. So write down on your paper, scrap paper, worksheet, whichever, on your paper, I want you to write down the birth years for each generation. And I'm going to give you about a minute to do that. Okay? A little bit longer. We want to get those years brainstormed out. All righty. Now I want you to pull up your chat box. We are going to be using the chat box a lot for the next, 7 slides. So get your chat box up. We're going to be using it. Starting with the greatest generation, please type the years the greatest generation was born in the chat box. Let's start typing answers. We have 1901 to 1927. We have 1900 to 1929. Other responses? We got 2 folks. That's the hardest one. All right, the next one is the silent generation. I would like you to type in chat. What are the birth years for the silent generation? So Christy writes 1930 to 1942. Bree writes 1928 to 1945. Okay, looks like Bree and Christy are going to use chat. Now the baby boom generation. Katie Massey writes 1930 to 1951. Now the baby boom generation. What are the birth years of the baby boom generation? (1955 to 1961, 1943 to 1964, late 40s to 60s, writes Matt. 1964 to, 1946 to 1964, 1955 to 1963. All right, the next generation, Generation X, the often forgot about generation, because those pesky millennials and those pesky boomers get all the attention. So what years were Generation X born? '65 to '80, '65 to '81, '60s to '80s, 1960 to 1980, 1964 to 1998. All right, millennials. Millennials are next. 1965 to 1980 for Gen X. What are millennials? '82 to 1999, 1981 to 1996. '80s to '95, '81 to '96, '81 to '96. Gen Z, the last generation that we're going to talk about, that's actually adults. Gen Alpha, they're not adults yet, so we're only going to talk about adults. 1997 to 2012 for Gen Z. 95 to 2010 for Gen Z. Any more guesses for our Gen Zs? So moving on, this slide shows the way that different generations define, or different organizations define the birth years of generations. As you can see from this slide, there are differences. Different organizations do define the birth years of each generation differently. For the purpose of this presentation, I do use Pew Research and the U.S. Census Bureau definitions of generations. Any questions or comments about the birth years before we move on? Is anyone surprised by the birth years, what they see on the screen? Somebody was naming them, Bree, I think was naming them like exactly. Peter. Okay, I don't see any comments, so we're going to go ahead and move forward. So I like to show this chart so you can actually visualize what the composition of our society actually looks like. There's tons of misinformation about the composition of our society. There's misunderstandings about which generation is the biggest. Looking at this chart, okay, to explain to you what you're looking at, it is busy, but bear with me. So this is a population pyramid. Initially, they were called pyramids because they were literally pyramid shaped. There was a whole bunch of young people and then not as many older people. The left blue side is male. The right yellow side is female. The ages start at the bottom, 0 to 5, and they go up in 5-year increments. The top is 85 years and older. I want you to put in the chat what jumps out at you about this graphic. And if you're comfortable unchatting, I don't mind, or unmuting, I don't mind if you do that.
I thought there would be more baby boomers.
Thanks, Christy, for sharing that. I was talking to someone yesterday, and I asked them, I didn't show them this graph, but I asked them to think about the population in, those 5-year increments, 0 to 5, 5 to 9, 10 to 14, all the way up to 85. And I asked her to guess which 5-year increment of or group of people is the largest. She guessed late 50s and 60s. Well, you can look at this chart and tell you that it was actually millennials who were age 30 to 34 in 2023. That was the biggest 5-year group. Leanne writes, fewer babies being born in the widest point for millennials, more like a box in a period. Absolutely, Kathy, and that is part of the transition that has happened in our demographics. Population drops significantly after 80 years old, and the more females than males, age 85 and older, Yes, absolutely. Women tend to outlive men, so you do see that kind of heavy female side, particularly among the 85 plus. So as you can see the ages that each group was in 2023 on this chart. So our Gen Alpha, these are our youngest generation. We're not going to really talk about them today, but they were 10 and under in 2023. Gen Z was 11 to 26. So we really can't say too terribly much about Gen Z because some of them are still teenagers. Millennials were age 27 to 42 in 2023. And then our Gen X was 43 to 58. Our boomers were 59 to 77. And our silent generation was age 78 to 95. All right, this next section of the presentation, we're going to be using the chat box a lot. There is a worksheet that I posted in chat. I am posting it again, and I'll actually hit send this time so it goes. For those of you who may jumped on, you could grab this worksheet. It will just help you guide the conversation. As I said, for this next part, we listen and we don't judge because we are going to, as a group, brainstorm the characteristics of each generation. And we are going to kick it off with the greatest generation. So please write traits and characteristics of the greatest generation in chat, including any coming of age historical events they might have faced. So write traits and characteristics and coming of age of events. So start writing those in chat. The worksheet is just a visual so you can see where I'm headed. It's just a tool to help you. So if you get done brainstorming one generation and you get all your ideas in the chat, you can move on. But please use chat to share your ideas. So Holly writes, World War II, work ethic, survived the Depression. Okay, so greatest generation. Okay. World War I and II, World War II, maybe in a nursing home. Retired for a very long time. I mean, yet the greatest generation right now are around 100. Angela Loftus, not many left. That's true. Okay. Now moving on to the silent generation. So let's look at a few more comments about the greatest. Top boomers, the value of the dime, LOL. Patriotic, may dependent on others, maybe dependent on others. So next is the silent generation. These folks were born from 1928 to 1945. What are the traits and characteristics of this group? What coming of age historical events did they face? Prohibition. That's true. There was prohibition. Well, I don't remember when prohibition was. Korean War, mobsters. World War II, Korean War, assassination of a president, civil rights leaders, Vietnam, writes Christie. Any other comments about the silent generation and their traits and characteristics? Big band, swing music, widespread discrimination, Great Depression, World War II. Dust Bowl, Great Depression, World War II. Huh? Our baby boomers, born 1946 to 1964. Television, that's a good thing that appeared. Television's huge. I could probably talk to you for an hour about what television has done to us. Revolution of love. Look, talk about our baby boomers. We got baby boomers on the call, so let's talk about the traits and characteristics of the baby boomers. Rock and roll. Vietnam War, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Disco. Protesting. The Beatles. Cold War. Vietnam War, Martin Luther King's speech in 1963. Gen X, and now we know we got some Gen X on the call. Princess Diana, civil rights movement, so that's still a little bit for the boomer. Start adding stuff about Gen X. Computers, Gen X, computers, that's good. AIDS, 9/11, cordless phones. Okay. Moving on to millennials or Gen Y. At one point they were called Gen Y and then they switched to millennials. So let's talk about our millennials. What are the characteristics of our millennials? What events did they face as they were coming of age? Or are facing, because our millennials technically are still pretty young. 9/11, yep. ...2008 housing crash, millennials. The internet, yep. Social media, oh yeah. Big changes in technology, increase in remote work. Big hair, puff sleeves, internet, cell phones. Who had big hair, Leanna? You might need to elaborate, because I always think of, like, Gen X as the big hair group, not millennials. Playing outside a lot, the best games toy. Yeah. Adaptable. Other traits of the millennials. The oldest millennial turns 44 this year. Wetterling. I don't know who Jacob Wetterling is. Able to work remotely. COVID. Okay, now we're getting to Gen Z. Oh, thanks, Angela, for clarifying that. Michelle writes, millennials grew up with tech. So now Gen Z, the oldest Gen Z turns 29 this year, or 28, 29. I might have done my math wrong. They're at the end of the oldest Gen Z is at late 20s. Oh, Angela writes, parents got super protective after that abduction. I can imagine why. Michelle writes, Gen Z grew up with technology. What is TikTok? What other things is Gen Z facing? Parenting style have really changed for them. School violence, oof. Yeah, but I was in high school when Columbine happened. And I don't remember the year, forgive me, but it was mid-90s. So yeah, the school violence, the suicides, the social media, the texting, increasingly faster overall pace of life. Yeah. Difficulty writing complete sentences, increase in teen depression. Okay, shorter attention, FOMO. I'm not up on the acronyms. I don't know what FOMO means. Increase, fear of missing out, gotcha. Okay, thank you everyone for just adding your thoughts and ideas to the chat box. Now the next thought activity for you is each one of us is a member of a generation. And I want you to type in chat. You may also unmute and describe how the qualities that the groups identified for your generation reflect your experiences, why or why not. So I'm looking for someone to give me some feedback. Do the qualities the group identified for your generation reflect your own experiences, why or why not? You can write in chat, you can unmute. Okay, I'm a 1981 millennial, and I definitely identified with, playing outside a lot. Identified with that. And I identify with having computers my whole time growing up. But the thing for me is I didn't really use them until I could get online in the mid-90s. And once I could get online in the mid-90s, then computers became interesting. But, prior to like 13, 14, I didn't really use computers that much, even though they were present. They were everywhere in the schools, but they weren't. So no thoughts about how these characteristics either reflect your experience or not? So cordless phones was a big shift from my part of my childhood, having to wait for calls because of no answering machine for a while. Kathy writes, as an older Gen Xer, I could definitely relate to the introduction of computers. Yeah, Kathy, I think that was kind of an interesting for someone to actually highlight that Gen X was exposed to computers first when you're talking about young generations. I was close to being a Gen X, but I had brothers who were boomers. I had the best of both generations. Kind of how I feel. My parents are boomers. Like, you can't even really say, like, constant screens as a boomer gets overwhelming for me. So it sounds like this group could identify with what was described in the chat. I forgot to mention dial-up internet earlier. It was easier to disconnect when you had to choose between the internet and the phone. That's a major difference, yeah. Changes in food prep. So, who is proud to be a member of their generation? So, have a comment in chat. I'm a millennial, 1987. I played outside a lot. I remember getting a computer and played games mostly on it, getting on the internet, depending on who needed to use the phone, burned CDs, had a great childhood. 9/11 during high school was sad, scary. It was one of the reasons my husband wanted to join the military. Christy's good with the generations. Well, what generations are you guys from if you're good from them? Some people don't like. I think it seems like people who were born in the early 80s and early 80s, late 70s don't seem to like their generation, or they identify with both. And you kind of see the same thing in the 60s, where people may not quite identify with boomer entirely. Good for you, Holly. Okay.
I'm a Generation X, and I think, Lisi, maybe as you age, it becomes better and you're just cool with wherever you are. But yeah, I'm good at being an Xer.
That's cool. Some people don't like it. See, there, Angela's doing it right there. Xennial. She's calling herself a Xennial. Angela, Xennial is a nonsense term. It's not used in scientific research at all. The reason those terms exist is because people don't like being called a millennial. That's the only reason that term Xennial, and science is wrong. Well, you're in the wrong profession if you think science is wrong, Angela. But I can tell you the limitations of generations. As a Gen Xer, I like having part of my life pre-computer internet and part of my life internet. I enjoy doing a lot IRL. Amy, you described kind of my expectation. I enjoyed having a analog childhood and then entering the internet world. Katie says, I don't like that people assume millennials are lazy because we have a different work ethic than the previous generation. Thanks, Katie. So finally, someone's kind of getting into the negative stereotypes. A lot of you guys were good and didn't put out a lot of negative stereotypes. Angela, do you see what's on my screen? Angela, do you see what's on my screen? You're like jumping ahead of what I'm about to talk about, because this whole presentation is actually about how the science of generations is completely wrong. So the limitations of generations, arbitrary boundaries, generational boundaries are not a hard science. We looked at that chart earlier. The boomers begin in 46, Gen X begins in 65, millennials begin in 81, Gen Z begins in 97. Who defined those years? Who picked that? Honestly, they're meaningless. The recommendation now, if you're trying to compare different age groups, is to go by decade, not some 20-year arbitrary lump that truly does not mean anything. Generations are also biased towards Western culture. They may not reflect the experiences of people who were not born in Western cultures. They don't account for the influence of external factors. Okay, another response opportunity for you. That picture on the screen, right in chat, what is it? What size floppy disk? Matt, you're wrong. That is a 5.5 floppy. I believe they were introduced in the 80s, early 80s. I would assume if you're a Gen X, You remember these from school? Is that true? Yes, Matt remembers it. Yes, very flimsy. I still have some. Yes, yes. Okay. All right. So Gen X. So those were my Gen X folks. Now millennials. Millennials, do you remember using these 5.5 floppies? I do. I'm a 1981 millennial. I do. Do I have any Gen Zs on this webinar right now? Michelle, those are 3.5-inch floppies. Thanks, Cheyenne. Gen Z. Do I have any Gen Z folks on the call? Maybe not. So the reason why I point this out is typically this technology was phased out, I think, 2000s, early 2000s. So typically you would not expect anybody who is Generation Z, you know, age 29 and younger, to be familiar with this technology. Yet, depending on where you live in the country, this very well could have been the technology that you were using in school, particularly in rural places who don't have the money to update technology every time the wind blows and we get some new spec or whatever. So that's why I highlight that. I have a colleague who just started. He's a 2000 Gen Z, and he was using these in high school. You think he's 25 years old and he remembers it. So those external influences really play a role in the type of characteristics you develop. I'm a 1981 millennial. I've been on the internet since 1993, 1994. You know, 3/4 of my life. A 1981 millennial who was born in South Dakota or some other rural place may not have been online as young as I was, even though we were technically born the same year. The generations exaggerate the intergenerational divide. They make it sound like the generations are just so different and they have nothing in common. Generations tend to emphasize youth when they're describing people. That's why I asked you about those events that were happening as people were coming of age. But the thing to understand, youth is not a permanent state. You know, youth is a developmental process that moves us towards maturity and wisdom and adulthood. We are not the same people as adults as we were in our youth. Generations. So, Angela, who's arguing me about Xennials, the reason, calling everyone born from 1981 to 1996 promotes overgeneralization and stereotypes and oversimplifications and leads to people rejecting existing generations and coming up with Generation Jones, Xennials, elder millennials. There's a bunch of different things. The thing to understand about any of those, they're marketing gimmicks. Generations promote stereotypes and they skew towards the experience of upper middle class people. And finally, they lack longitudinal data. There is limited data available to compare age groups over time, and research methods change. You literally have to ask somebody, a group of people, a question when they're 25, one generation when they're 25, and then the other generation when they're 25, and then another generation when they're 25. You have to ask everybody the same exact question, the same exact way when they're the same exact age. And that data simply is not available to make any generalizations or comparisons between the generations. All right, I do want to show you an example of what that data actually looks like. Gen Z is not included, as I said. Many of them are still teenagers. What this graph on the screen shows you is a compilation of census data from the 1960s. It takes 4 generations, millennials, Gen X, boomer, and silent, and looks at their child rearing and living habits, ages 23 to 38 at 4 different times. So in 1968, they looked at silent generation members and looked at this data. In 1987, they looked at the boomer for this data. In Gen Z, Gen X, they looked at 2003. Millennials, they looked at 2019. And this allows you to look and see meaningful differences between the generations. This chart shows you that millennials live with a spouse and child at lower rates than previous generations. But data like this that allows you to actually look at generations at different points in time is largely unavailable. And what I know going forward is that researchers who are using generations are going to be moving away from these labels. In the future, they are going to look at people born in the 1980s, people born in the 1990s, people born in the 1940s, because that gives you a, objective start point and end point for each age cohort that you're trying to look at. Any thoughts or reflections on this graphic? Someone commented about the decline in births. We could see that on the population pyramid, and you can see it here too. Any comments about this graphic? You can add comments later, that's fine. But how do you use generations effectively? And I decided just to read directly from Michael Demick, who wrote this article on Pew Research. The eras in which we come of age leave a significant signature of common experience and perspectives. Events such as terrorist attacks, wars, recessions, and pandemics can shape the opportunities and mindsets of those most affected by them. Similarly, historical advances like desegregation, effective birth control, the invention of the internet, and the arrival of artificial intelligence can fundamentally change how people live their lives, and the youngest generations are often in the vanguard. At the same time, some events can affect people across generations, moving everyone in one direction or another. It is wise to think of terms like Gen X, Millennial, Gen Z, Baby Boomer as general reference points instead of facts. They can help you get a sense of what a person was exposed to in their youth, but again, the current generations, the window of time is so wide that what an older member of the generation experienced in their youth is not going to be the same as what a younger member experienced in their youth. And somebody mentioned an assassination or something, and I can't remember what it was, but it was a great example. It happened at the end of the 60s. Well, those boomers who were born at the beginning of the 60s would have no reference to that event. Another example that I can show you is the Challenger explosion. I almost think the cutoff between Gen X and millennials is whether or not you remember that disaster on television in school. But then again, the oldest of the Gen X wouldn't remember that because they would have been out of school when that happened. So look by generations when you're thinking, or decades of birth, when you're trying to understand a group of people and what affects them. So Michelle writes, decline in birth rates, possibly from both spouses needing to work, not being able to afford to stay at home, or more focused on careers and starting a family. There's definitely some difference, and I think a lot of people have different opinions on why. My primary advice to you is it pays off to interact with people as unique individuals rather than just members of a generation or like-minded group. And that's what the problem with generations. They suggest that everybody grouped or born between a certain number of years is the same, and nothing could be further from the truth, especially when you're talking about like how we develop and grow over time. When we're young people, we're very similar. We have pretty similar experiences. We've been to school, we had extracurricular activities, we're probably not married, we probably don't have kids, we're probably looking to schooling or training of some sort. But as we get older, we become more different because our experiences become different. We have children, we travel, we pick different careers, what have you. So we become more diverse as we get older. Communication across the generations. Perhaps the biggest stereotype I want to bust is about which generations use which technology. That idea really needs to be spread out in your brain a little bit more, because income really is the better predictor of technology use than generational membership. What we see is people who have a higher income are more likely to have broadband, have cellular, have multiple devices. And the key to being skilled at using technology is to have access to it and to use it frequently. So people with more money have the ability to buy more diverse technology, use more diverse technology. Lower income people, you're going to find stuff like they might be cell phone only, mobile only for their internet. So it's really important to not assume any generation is one way or another. Don't assume one generation likes to text, or one generation likes social media, or one generation likes email, or one generation likes virtual presentations, or one generation likes in-person presentations. You really need to ask people, how do they like to communicate? Do they like to receive text messages? Do they like to receive emails? Do they like you to mail them stuff? Because that is going to vary by individual, not generation. So I'm encouraging you, don't assume, oh, they're a boomer, they don't like to use personal computers. They don't like to use computers. I had somebody tell me that on this webinar when I did it a week ago. Old people I know don't like to use desktop computers. That's a stereotype. You have to ask. This one is classic. Most of you are familiar with this. You statements versus I statements. It's important to describe how we're affected by a situation. You know, if we're dealing, with our, a farm or a ranch, it might be like, I'm concerned about the future of the farm because I don't know the details of the transition plan. Or maybe that's not the best way, but the idea is how are you affected? I feel like my time doesn't matter when I have to come home and clean a sink full of dishes. Speaking in a way that describes how you're affected. How to talk about sensitive topics. Be proactive. Don't wait. You need to start getting these done early. Do your homework. If you are observing suspicious things concerning things in your friends, your families, your relatives, and your business partners, you need to start documenting what you're seeing. Keep a notebook. Document what you're seeing. Like if they're not paying bills, or if they're not using equipment safely, or whatever, they're driving erratically, you need to start documenting it. That way, when you come to discuss the topic, you have examples and evidence. Choose the right time and place. This can vary. I mean, you don't want people to be tired and stressed out. Some people don't like the holidays for talking about sensitive topics, but sometimes these conversations need to happen in person, so that could be the time when everyone is together. Be honest and clear. Don't sugarcoat stuff. Show empathy and compassion, especially when we're dealing about illness, declining health, transitioning a business. I mean, these are very emotional and hard things to go with. So be sure to show empathy and compassion. Involve professionals, especially so much of the stuff that we deal with as we get older. You need an attorney, you need an accountant, you need people who understand how everything works. You can't do this DIY legal and financial planning in most cases. Follow up. These conversations are not done easily. You need to follow up and routinely. Get your own house in order. That's my number one tip. If you are trying to talk to your parents about their financial power of attorney, their healthcare power of attorney, transitioning a business, what have you, it's important to get your own house in order, and you can always start the discussion with, hey, I have got my financial power of attorney done. I've got my healthcare power of attorney done. I want to talk to you about who is the decision maker and the kind of decisions they might make, to make it clear. So that's some ideas about how to handle those sensitive topics. Communicating about advancing age, that is my specialty, and really it's really imperative that we be cognizant in how we talk about advancing age. There are many people who are completely uncomfortable with the idea of getting older. They're uncomfortable with the idea of illness and decline. They are uncomfortable with everything that one might associate with advancing age. And as a result, you know, people have these mental images in their head about what it means to become an older person. And unless we can break through those, it's going to be difficult to try to solve some of the challenges. You know, so labeling. Generally, my field, the scientists from my field recommend avoiding, I'm saying avoid, terms such as senior, senior citizen, the elderly, elderly, even seasoned, like I've heard someone call an older person seasoned, or even young lady. When you say to someone who's older, oh, young lady, you're implying that being older is not a good thing indirectly by saying they're young when clearly you can tell they're an older adult. The recommended term, you may have heard me, is older adult, older farmer, older rancher, older volunteer, older student, older person, older adult. Othering is another thing to talk about. We often talk about aging as if it's happening to some other person. The fact of the matter is each and every one of you is older now than when you were when we started this conversation today. Each person is aging right now, actively. Aging does not begin at 60 or 65. So the choices you make today affect the options that are available for you in the future when it comes to aging. So if you want to age in place, you have to be engaged in that now. Elder speak is an overly familiar way of talking to an older person that honestly sounds like baby talk. You might say something like, hey, sweetie, you want to take your medicine, don't you? Oh, aren't you just the cutest? It's a really inappropriate way to speak with an older person. And the evidence, the science tells us that, particularly people with dementia, if you speak to them using elder speak, they will start acting out, because they know that you look down upon them. They can perceive how you think about them just by the way you're talking to them. And then the last thing when we're talking about advancing age is we often talk about a crisis. Like if you look at the demographics, you listen to the media, people talk about the demographic cliff. You know, we're ruined. We have too many older people. It's the end of the world. Like, oh my gosh, the sky is falling. They're trying to like get people excited and get people like engaged, but it honestly has the opposite effect. People, they shut down, they don't want to talk about it, they're afraid, and ultimately nothing happens. Instead, creativity, innovation. So you got a farm. So how can you use creativity and innovation in your language to talk about transitioning your farm to the next generation? Like, so instead of catastrophe language of, if you don't plan, we're going to lose the farm, use language instead that says, if we can be creative and innovative, we can make sure our farm lasts for the next generation. So just a switch in how you frame it. Now, how do parents talk to kids on and off the farm? I think you have to discuss the goals and priorities of the business. The farm is a business. So you have to be clear about what the goals are. You know, if the goal is to keep the business completely intact and pass it on to one adult child, that has to be clear. Discuss the roles and responsibility. Who's who? Who's going to do what? Who's going to make sure that the goals for the business are achieved? Discuss the resources needed. You know, if you have to get life insurance to cover, you know, operating notes or whatever, you have to let folks know, hey, this is what we need to accomplish our goals. And this is related to that, be transparent and honest. Sometimes these operations, these farms, these ranches have large operating notes, and there really is no opportunity to leave anything to the off-farm family. Every estate planning activity has to be focused on shoring up that farm so that it stays financially stable. So I think that those are hard conversations that you have to have when you're talking about farming and ranching. Summary of our presentations. Generations are difficult to objectively measure and scientifically study. However, they can serve as a reference to help us understand the era when a person came of age. The events of our youth do shape how we live our lives. The pitfalls of thinking of people in terms of their generation are well documented. Generations promote stereotype. They promote oversimplification. It exaggerates the differences between the generations. To communicate across generations, you have to see each person as an individual and not some member of a generation. You have to treat them that way. And when we're talking about communicating, every family has members from generations, and yes, we do have different experiences that shape us. But remember, we're not all the same. So when we're trying to communicate about sensitive topics, start now. Don't expect these conversations to move quickly, especially when dealing with difficult topics like illness, dying, or transitioning a business. I will tell you, I have these slides. If you want these slides, I can send me an email, and I'll go back to that right here. So there's my email. If you want the slides, I will email them to you. I'm ready to answer questions. We got about 6 minutes to answer questions and have some conversation. People organize their thoughts. I mean, generations really are a marketing gimmick at this point. They're comedy on social media. I mean, that's really what they serve as at this point. Thanks, Holly.
Lisi, do you see the people that are researching going to this decade analysis versus the wider span of years, generations?
I know Pew Research has, I was just reading an article, they were talking about the religious Christianity in America. And in that article, they looked by decade and they compared religiosity by decade instead of by generation. So I think the more quality ones are stepping away from generational research because it's not objective science.
And it's good to be aware that, the generations are used as a technique for marketing, and then also for maybe inappropriate humor, whatever it might be, and that it just really doesn't have anything to do with who those humans are. It's just a way to label people in just yet another way.
It is. Always need to be checked for biases, and we do have biases. When I did this webinar the first time, someone called millennials entitled. So of course I was able to say, you know what, I don't feel very entitled as a 1981 millennial. I don't feel very entitled, but we have biases, and the more we can step away from the generational labels, the more we're not going to tap into those biases, because there are biases. I mean, there's biases that Gen X is the latchkey kids. They had a key around their neck, and truly we got to remember that reflects the experiences of high income Gen X kids, Pew does good work. I mean, Pew, it's only been within the past few years that Pew Research has really said, yeah, we're going to really kind of do it a little bit different. Do it a little differently now going forward to try to compare age groups. Candace writes, it's interesting when you look at the media and how they describe a generation, they could be talking about any of the generations. That's just it, Candace. I identify with Gen X. I have that rugged, leave me alone, I'm going to do it my own way, I don't need your help, Gen X attitude. My son made the mistake of calling my mom elderly. She corrected him and said, if you call me anything, call me wise. Hear, hear. Hear, hear. Anyone can be wise, Katie. Yes. Wisdom, I do a whole program on wisdom. So you should follow me. I do some cool stuff on wisdom writing. But wisdom is, I could do a whole hour on gerotranscendence, which is a theory that describes healthy mental and emotional development in aging, and ultimately that process that moves us towards wisdom. Those processes happen midlife. We think it happens, like lay people think it happens later, but those processes that start moving us towards wisdom happen like earlier in life. Women who have children start those processes earlier than women who don't have children, and men. And it's really as you go through things in your life that cause you to reevaluate who you are and your place in the world, such as becoming a mother, that moves you towards that maturity, that wisdom. Thank you, Christy, for posting that link for me. Please complete our feedback form. We offer webinars on the first Monday every month at 10 a.m. Central. Recordings to our other webinars can be found on the North Central Region Aging Network website. That's incran.org. So definitely check out our other webinars, and I appreciate you being here with us today.
Thank you, Lisa. You did a fantastic job, and thank you to everybody that attended today. Lisa stepped in at the very last minute and offered to do this webinar, so thank you. And we hope that you will join us in future webinars.
Bye, everybody.